They shot his dog. Without warning, without a word of restraint. They pulled the trigger, and the sound tore through Isaiah Jackson's soul like the echo of every war he'd survived. 1 second, Max was barking, loyal and protective. The next, he lay motionless on the cracked pavement, his body twitching once before going still under the cold glow of a streetlight. That sound, that hollow thud of life leaving the only creature that had ever saved him, would haunt Isaiah forever. Before we dive into this story, tell me where you're watching from, and please, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Hit the like button if you believe no man, no matter his color, should ever have to lose the only friend who kept him alive. Isaiah Jackson was not a man easily broken. At 38, he carried the quiet strength of someone who had seen too much and survived what others could not. 15 years in Delta Force had carved him into steel, but the kind of steel that remembers the fire that forged it, the battles in Afghanistan, the raids in Iraq, the faces of brothers lost in explosions that still echoed in his dreams. After returning home to Chicago's South Side, he'd built a fragile peace around a single companion, Max, a German shepherd with a heart as fierce as his own. When PTSD had dragged Isaiah to the edge, when the gun in his hand felt like the only way out, Max had placed a paw on his leg, whining softly, refusing to let go. That dog wasn't just a pet. He was his lifeline, his anchor to humanity. That evening, the air in Englewood was thick with tension, the kind Isaiah could feel even before he turned the corner. He wasn't a man who sought trouble, but trouble seemed to find him anyway. The 2 patrol officers who stopped him, Vincent Russo and Patrick Sullivan, were names whispered in the neighborhood like a curse. Men known for using the badge as a weapon, not a duty. Russo, a stocky man in his 40s with cold, bitter eyes, carried the kind of anger that couldn't be reasoned with. His son had been killed years ago in a gang shooting by a black teenager, and since then, every black man in Chicago was his enemy. Sullivan was younger, meaner, always a step behind Russo like a loyal dog who hadn't realized his master was rabid. "Evening, soldier." Russo sneered as he stepped out of the squad car, hand already resting on his holster. "What's a man like you doing out here this late? You lost, or just looking for trouble?" Isaiah kept his tone calm. Even, "I live 3 blocks down. Officer, just walking my dog." Russo smirked. "Your dog looks mean. You sure he's not trained to attack cops?" Max stood beside Isaiah, ears perked, tail still, muscles tense but disciplined. Isaiah had trained him to sense fear, not to cause it. But fear is what these men brought with them. Fear wrapped in authority. Fear that justified their violence. Sullivan stepped closer, flashlight in Isaiah's face. "Let's see some ID." Isaiah reached slowly into his jacket, moving like a man who'd done this before. But his silence only irritated Russo. "You people think you can walk around here like you own the place," Russo hissed. "You don't belong here." That word, "you people," hung in the air like poison. Isaiah swallowed his anger. But inside, something began to tremble. Years of discipline kept him steady, but the sound of Max's low growl broke the silence. Russo turned sharply. "Control your mutt. He's just being protective," Isaiah said softly. Sullivan laughed. "Looks dangerous to me." And then it happened. No warning, no escalation, just a gunshot. The flash lit up the night. Max yelped once, a sound that cracked Isaiah's heart wide open. He dropped to his knees, blood spreading across his hands as he cradled Max's head. The dog's eyes looked up at him one last time, confused. "Loyal to the end," Isaiah whispered. "Stay with me, buddy, please." But Max was already gone. Russo holstered his gun, face blank, voice cold. "Black dogs die easy." That sentence would replay in Isaiah's mind 1,000 times. Then the pain turned to rage. He didn't remember lunging forward, didn't remember shouting, but the crack of a taser brought him down hard. The pavement scraped his face. The taste of metal filled his mouth. Sullivan's boot pressed on his neck while Russo leaned down and whispered, "Resisting arrest, huh? You people never learn." They left him cuffed and bleeding beside Max's body. Neighbors recorded the scene on their phones, some crying, others too afraid to speak. By the time paramedics arrived, the officers were gone. Hours later, inside a dimly lit police station, Isaiah sat in silence. His wrists bled from the cuffs, but he said nothing. Not until the door opened and a woman's voice, sharp, furious, cut through the air. "Get your hands off my brother!" Naomi Carter had arrived, a civil rights lawyer with a fire that burned just as bright as Isaiah's rage. She forced his release, citing unlawful detention and excessive force. The desk sergeant didn't dare argue. In the car ride home, Naomi's hands trembled on the wheel. "You need to file a lawsuit. Zay, you can't let them get away with this." Isaiah stared out the window, silent. The city lights blurred into streaks of color. "They killed Max. Naomi." "I know," she whispered, her eyes welling. "But revenge won't bring him back." He turned to her, voice low but steady. "It's not about revenge. It's about balance." That night, back in his small apartment, Isaiah sat in the dark beside Max's empty bed. His hands traced the collar, still warm from earlier that day. The silence was unbearable. He thought about the 4 men he'd lost overseas, the friends who died following orders, the innocents caught in crossfire, and now, his dog, his peace, stolen by the same kind of men who claimed to protect and serve. He opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo. Him and Max, both smiling at a training ground years ago. Behind the picture was something else, a folded patch that read Delta Force, Silent Professionals. He hadn't worn it since retirement, but tonight, the weight of it felt different. Not pride, not nostalgia, purpose. Isaiah stood, shoulders squared, the soldier in him awakening again. "You took my peace," he murmured into the empty room. "Now I'll take your comfort." He didn't mean to kill them. Not yet. What he wanted was something worse, to make them feel the same fear, the same helplessness they'd left him with, and somewhere deep inside. He knew this path would either destroy him or save him from the darkness he'd been running from, outside. The sirens in Englewood wailed again, distant but familiar, but Isaiah wasn't afraid anymore. For the first time in years, he had a mission, and this time, it wasn't for his country, it was for Max. The night after Max's death was the longest of Isaiah Jackson's life. Sleep refused to come, and when it did, it came like a thief, dragging him back to the battlefield he could never escape. He saw fire, sand, and blood. He saw the faces of his fallen brothers, and then he saw Max, running toward him, only to vanish in a burst of gunfire. He woke with a start, drenched in sweat, the sound of that gunshot still echoing in his ears. His hands shook as he poured himself a glass of water. The silence in his apartment was unbearable. The bed where Max used to sleep beside him was now just a folded blanket that smelled like loyalty, grief, and memory. At dawn, Naomi knocked on his door, still in her work clothes, exhaustion written across her face. She'd been on the phone all night, trying to reach the Internal Affairs Division, the state attorney, anyone who would listen. Nobody did. "They're saying Max attacked first," she said quietly, handing Isaiah a printout of the police report. "They're twisting it already." Isaiah read the report line by line, his jaw tightening. "They said he lunged. He didn't lunge. Naomi, he barked, that's all." "I know," she replied, "but the witnesses are scared. Nobody wants to testify against those 2. She sat across from him, her tone shifting from anger to sorrow. "You have to let me handle this through the courts. I can file a federal complaint. Demand body cam footage. Isaiah looked up slowly, his eyes hollow. You think those body cams were on? Naomi paused. She didn't answer, because she knew the truth. Russo and Sullivan were smart enough to turn them off whenever they wanted to. It wasn't the first time, and it wouldn't be the last. For the next few days, Isaiah stayed inside. He didn't eat much. He barely spoke. He sat by the window at night, staring at the empty street where Max had taken his last breath. Every time he heard a siren, his body tensed. It wasn't fear. It was readiness, the old soldier instinct reawakening. He watched the local news and saw the same tired narrative. Officers involved in incident under review. That phrase burned in his chest like acid. Under review meant forgotten. Under review meant nothing would change. On the 5th day, Isaiah went back to the scene. The blood had been washed away, but he could still feel it there, seeping into the cracks of the concrete. A little boy from the neighborhood watched him from a porch and said softly, "Mister, that was your dog, right? My mom said he was brave." Isaiah managed a faint smile. "He was," he said. "He still is." That night, he went to Naomi's office downtown. She had files spread across her desk, photographs, reports, names of victims who had filed complaints against Russo and Sullivan. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a document. A 17-year-old boy, killed during a traffic stop. A woman, wrongfully arrested for resisting when she just asked why they pulled her over. A man beaten so badly he can't walk anymore. And another one, 25, framed for drugs he never had. Same 2 names every time. Isaiah scanned the papers silently, the anger rising inside him like a tide. And they're still on the street. "Yes," Naomi said, frustration breaking her voice, "because every time someone files a complaint, it disappears. The department protects them. Captain Brooks signed off on their last review, saying they were under evaluation." Isaiah stood up, pacing the room. "You're telling me there are 4 victims, maybe more, and they're still wearing badges?" Naomi nodded. "I'm telling you the system isn't made to protect men like you." Isaiah turned toward the window, staring at the city lights. His reflection in the glass looked older, harder. "Then maybe it's time someone changed the system," he said quietly. Naomi's eyes widened. "Zay, no, don't you dare go down that road again. You promised me after the war you'd never—" "I promised I'd never kill without reason," he interrupted, voice steady. "But I didn't promise to stand by and watch." She stood, stepping closer, her tone trembling. "You go after them. They'll make you the criminal. That's what they do. You're not in the desert anymore. You're in their world." Isaiah looked at her, the faintest trace of a bitter smile forming. "Then I'll make them play by my rules." Naomi pressed a hand to his chest. "You're not hearing me. You can't win like that. You'll lose everything you've rebuilt. Please, Zay, don't let them take what's left of you." He held her hand for a moment, then gently moved it away. They already did. For a long time. Neither spoke. The hum of the city filled the silence. Finally, Naomi whispered, "At least promise me you'll think. Don't rush into this." "I always think," he said softly. "That's what makes it work." When Isaiah left her office that night, he walked through the loop, past the courthouse where justice was supposed to live. The building loomed over him like a monument to hypocrisy. He thought of the lawyers, the judges, the reports, all of it meaningless against the cold truth that Max was gone because 2 men believed they could play God with a gun. As he walked, he saw posters on light poles. "Justice for Jamal. End police brutality. Stop the silence." Different names. Same pain. He realized then that Max wasn't the only victim. Every face on those posters carried the same story. People hurt, ignored, forgotten. When he reached his apartment, the rain began to fall. Isaiah stood at the doorway, watching droplets run down the windows like tears. He didn't turn on the lights. Instead, he went to the shelf where Max's leash still hung. He touched it, then took down a small metal box from the top cabinet. Inside was a stack of old military drives, encrypted mission logs from his Delta Force years. He hadn't opened them in years, but tonight, the sight of them felt like clarity. He plugged one into his laptop, scanning through lines of data, recon techniques, surveillance plans, tactical strategies. He knew these skills were built for war, not justice, but war was the only language men like Russo and Sullivan understood. As the rain hit harder, Isaiah began to plan, not revenge, but retribution, cold, methodical, precise, the kind that didn't need bullets to make a point, just truth, exposure, and fear. He mapped out the officers' patrol routes, the stations they frequented, the bars they visited after hours. Every move they made was predictable. They had grown arrogant in their protection, believing no one would dare challenge them. By midnight, his screen was filled with notes, dates, and photos. The old soldier inside him was fully awake now, disciplined, focused. He whispered under his breath, "You took my peace. I'll take your certainty." For Isaiah Jackson, justice was no longer a word. It was a mission, and this time, it would be carried out with the precision of a man who'd spent his life mastering the art of war. Isaiah moved like a shadow that knew the city's weaknesses. Every step was measured, every breath steady, because the soldier inside him understood observation the way others understood prayer. He began by listening. Quiet conversations outside corner stores, the rhythm of patrol shifts, the casual swagger of Russo and Sullivan as they walked into the same bar after midnight and left with the same drunk grin. He watched their cars, learned the cadence of their days, noted which alley lights were always left broken so their crimes could hide in the dark. It wasn't vengeance yet. It was intelligence gathering. And it was clinical, because grief had taught him that clarity saved lives the way confusion cost them. Naomi pushed for legal avenues, for calls to internal affairs, for a civil suit that might expose a pattern. She collected names, filed complaints, drafted subpoenas. She built paper trails that might one day be used in a courtroom. Isaiah respected her work, but he'd seen paper eaten by bureaucracy before. The system could take its time while people disappeared into the margins. He didn't have that luxury. Not with Max's collar still on the hook, not with the echo of that single gunshot nailed into his skull. He found allies in places he hadn't expected. The Chicago Justice League, a loose collection of community organizers, investigative bloggers, a retired reporter with an old Rolodex, and a couple of ex-cops who had quit when their consciences overtook their paychecks, welcomed him without questions. They moved with a different kind of courage, petitions, public records requests, rooftop banners, and a willingness to stand between the cameras and those who would hide. They believed in exposing truth with light. Isaiah believed in sharpening the light. Together, they mapped Russo and Sullivan's connections, landlords, club owners, dealers, and the quiet men who carried cash in envelopes and smiles in meetings. It didn't take long to find the thread that tied the two officers to the Latin Kings, a pattern of protection fees, unexplained withdrawals, and late-night handoffs behind shuttered bodegas. The Justice League's activist who watched the nightlife. Malik Thompson, a former boxer with hands that still remembered how to hurt. Found a ledger in a dumpster behind a club, wet and smelling of beer, with names and amounts penciled in a shaky hand. Isaiah stared at the numbers and felt something in his chest settle. Evidence, even trash-stained, was evidence. They set cameras, small, cheap, almost invisible, beneath signage, inside hedges, tucked beneath awnings. Isaiah's hands worked the way they had overseas. Snap a lens here, hide a battery pack there, route a feed to a secure drive Naomi could subpoena if needed. He taught Malik a handful of surveillance tricks from an old playbook, not to create violence but to guarantee witness. The feeds captured whispered meetings, a hand passing an envelope, the quick nods between a cop and a gang lieutenant. That footage became the backbone of their claim. But it was fragile law, something the department could bury if they wanted. Isaiah knew they needed leverage that would sting, so he baited them. He leaked a rumor on a neighborhood forum, a tip that someone had proof of the officers taking payoffs. It was enough to make Russo restless, enough to make him look for retribution rather than restraint. The cops retaliated predictably. Russo's posture hardened. Sullivan's smirk grew thin and sharp. They rode roughshod through the neighborhood, jarring residents with stop-and-frisk tactics meant to silence any witness who might speak. It was in that rush of arrogance that Isaiah learned about Rico, a man with more scars than friends. Rico had a reputation in the underworld for making problems disappear. Russo's name in his phone was labeled with a single word: clean. Isaiah watched Rico from afar for days. How he moved, who he met, the way his eyes scanned exits like a man who never wanted a second seat. He learned Rico liked parks at night because the lights made it easier for him to blend into the background and be invisible. Then the night in the park came. Heavy rain, the kind that washes the color out of everything and makes footsteps whisper on pavement. Isaiah had felt a wariness that night, but not fear. Fear was for those without skill, without purpose. He used the weather to his advantage. Rain muffled sound, made the cops cautious, and made Rico overconfident. When Rico stepped from the shadow thinking he was at an easy job, Isaiah met him with the kind of controlled violence that had been honed over decades, a practiced disengage, a twist that redirected momentum, an elbow into a soft spot, and a hand that found the vulnerable line behind a man's ear. The fight was ugly enough to be real and precise enough to be quick. Isaiah didn't want spectacle. He only wanted to stop Rico's breath long enough to tell him, in a voice as low and certain as a verdict, that the men who hired him were not untouchable. Rico came at him with a knife and left with a broken wrist and a story to tell. Isaiah didn't kill him. Instead, he bound him, recorded his confession, and let the rain wash the lie from his clothes. When Savage, one of the younger activist members, asked later why he hadn't simply handed Rico to the police, Isaiah's reply was simple and cold. Because they're part of the network. He could see the truth in their faces then. The Justice League had expected a headline, a dramatic arrest that would fix everything. Isaiah had learned that networks don't collapse from one open wound. They collapse when everyone in the network fears exposure. So he fed Rico's confession into a carefully timed release, sending encrypted clips to an investigative journalist who had a reputation for hitting hard and fast. The journalist's article landed like a thunderclap. Photos, names, a ledger, and a quote from a frightened Rico describing cash exchanges with men in uniform. The neighborhood buzzed. Protests started to gather steam. And for a moment, Isaiah allowed himself the small satisfaction of seeing truth reach light. But Russo didn't bow. If anything, the exposure fed his fury. He made a phone call in the dark that Isaiah knew would have consequences. "Erase him," Russo told the voice on the other end. Words spoken with the confidence of a man who believed laws were suggestions. Sullivan's loyalty hardened into a dangerous obedience. Naomi's calls suddenly had to be whispered. Her office received threats thinly veiled as warnings. Isaiah felt the net tighten. He told Naomi what he'd done, watching the way her jaw clenched. "Zay, you told me you wouldn't." she began, voice cracking. He cut her off gently. I didn't start violence. I exposed it. This is your fight, too. She pressed a hand to his arm, fear and love braided together. Promise me you'll be careful. He promised the thing that a soldier promises before going into harm's way. And she heard the lie wrapped in it. Sullivan began to show cracks, the late-night glances, the way he flinched when a siren wailed. He'd watched images of himself with cash in a dumpster, and something in him might have whispered doubt, but his sense of belonging to Russo's system drowned it. The department's weak denials gave way to stronger denials from people who mattered. And Captain Daniel Brooks, when confronted, offered a public statement of confidence in his officers while quietly grinding the gears to preserve the status quo. Isaiah watched the machinery move and felt the bitter taste of the world he'd chosen to fight. He understood then that winning would not be a single glorious moment. It would be a slow erosion of courage in men who had used power to hide shame. So he continued. He planted another camera behind a shuttered storefront, slipped a tiny microphone into a gutter, and set up a false trail that led Russo toward a bar where a meeting was supposed to be. Knowing full well that the bar's manager would cough up a story when pressured, he baited and recorded, lured and exposed, each step deliberate, each move a chess piece aimed not at killing, but at removing the safety Russo and Sullivan had wrapped themselves in, and through every risk. Naomi's voice haunted him with one simple, repeated plea. Come back to me. The first time Isaiah struck back, he did it with the precision of a man who had spent half his life learning how to disappear between breaths. It was a Thursday night in Wrigleyville, music in the bars, laughter spilling into the street, the kind of chaos that hid intention. Russo parked his unmarked car near an alley off Clark Street, confident, unguarded, talking loudly on the phone about handling that soldier problem. Isaiah had been waiting for 3 nights. He moved when the crowd's noise reached its loudest pitch. The first blow came from the shadows, a calculated strike to the ribs, fast, surgical, breaking 3 in one motion. Russo stumbled, gasping, before Isaiah caught him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. You remember my dog? He whispered. Russo's eyes went wide, breath shallow, the sound of pain replacing his arrogance. This is just the start, Isaiah said, his voice low, controlled, almost calm. Then he dropped him, disappearing before the bystanders even realized the scuffle had happened. The next morning, every cop in the precinct whispered about the attack, though no one dared say Russo's name. Officially, it was a random mugging. Unofficially, it was humiliation. Russo's pride burned hotter than his broken ribs. He thinks he can play soldier in my city? He spat, clutching his side. Eyes wild, Sullivan tried to calm him, but loyalty to Russo was an anchor dragging him deeper into madness. He's ex-military. Vince, you go at him head on. You'll end up worse. Russo sneered. Then we make him the criminal. We frame him so clean the feds will thank us for locking him up. That same day, Isaiah noticed 2 new cars tailing him. He expected them. He even welcomed it. He wanted Russo to believe he was sloppy. That night, as he walked into the casino at Navy Pier, the cameras caught everything, his entry, the poker table, the timestamp. He played a few hands, laughed with the dealer, left generous tips. Every second was part of the alibi, across town. A planted tip led Russo to believe Isaiah was selling stolen weapons in a warehouse near the South Side docks. When the cops raided it, they found nothing but a timer rigged to release a cloud of red dye and a single message taped to the wall. Truth bleeds red, too. That message spread across social media within hours. Activists called it poetic. The department called it a threat. Russo called it war. He doubled down, meeting quietly with a man named Rico's cousin, another street enforcer willing to trade muscle for cash. They planned to catch Isaiah off guard, But Isaiah was already 3 steps ahead. He intercepted their encrypted messages, rerouted their meeting location, and turned the trap inside out. When the hired gun arrived at a warehouse near Calumet, he found himself staring down a camera and a man who didn't raise his voice. "You're being recorded," Isaiah said. "You walk away now. You live. You keep working for them. You'll join them." The man froze, trembling, then dropped the gun and ran. Naomi found out 2 days later. She stormed into Isaiah's apartment, waving a newspaper headline, "Vigilante targets corrupt cops?" and slammed it on his table. "What are you doing, Zay? You're giving them exactly what they want. They'll spin this until you're the villain." Isaiah didn't look up. "I'm not the villain," he said quietly. "I'm the reminder." She exhaled sharply. "The law can still work if we push hard enough." Isaiah turned to her, eyes tired but steady. "You still believe that?" "I don't." The silence that followed was heavy, filled with everything they'd both lost, their faith in justice, their childhood belief that truth was enough. Naomi wanted to scream, but she saw something in his eyes she hadn't seen since the war, clarity without peace. She knew then he wouldn't stop. Meanwhile, Russo's desperation reached its breaking point. He began leaking false reports, claiming Isaiah was connected to local gangs, implying weapons trafficking, drug money, whatever he could fabricate. Sullivan hesitated, his conscience cracking. "We're crossing a line. Vince, the Bureau's sniffing around. Brooks can't cover for us forever," Russo snapped. "Brooks owes me. He'll look the other way." But Captain Daniel Brooks wasn't blind. He'd seen this kind of spiral before. Men who thought the badge made them gods. He called Russo into his office, voice low but sharp. "You're out of control. Stand down before this buries us all." Russo smirked. "You afraid of one man, Captain? A washed-up soldier with a dead dog?" Brooks glared at him. "I'm afraid of the truth, Russo, and it's catching up to you faster than you think." The next night, Russo ignored orders. He and Sullivan cruised Englewood, pulling over cars, harassing locals, trying to draw Isaiah out. What they didn't know was that Isaiah had planted another layer of surveillance, hidden microphones, small enough to fit inside light fixtures, recorded every word of their threats, every racist slur, every extortion demand. Those files became Isaiah's ammunition, uploaded to a secure cloud and encrypted twice. He wasn't just fighting back, he was documenting everything. By the end of that week, Isaiah felt the weight of what he'd started. Each move drew him deeper into a war without medals, without honor. He'd begun to taste something bitter, victory without joy. Naomi visited him again, softer this time, her voice fragile. "You think hurting them will heal you?" He shook his head. "No, but it'll make them remember what they did." For a brief moment, her eyes softened. "I just want my brother back." He looked at her then, almost breaking. "You'll get what's left of him." Outside, Sullivan sat in his patrol car, watching Isaiah's building through the rain-streaked windshield. His partner had ordered him to plant drugs in Isaiah's trunk, to make it stick this time. But his hands trembled as he held the small bag. He thought about his own kids, about the headlines, about the way Isaiah had looked at Russo that night in the alley. Something about that look, the calm precision of it, had made him realize they weren't dealing with an ordinary man. He slipped the drugs back into his pocket and drove away. The next morning, Isaiah woke to news of a supposed federal interest in his case. He knew what it meant. Russo had tried to push the FBI's organized crime task force into investigating him. But Isaiah's alibi held. The casino footage was airtight, timestamps aligned, witnesses confirmed. The Bureau found nothing, except whispers of corruption that pointed back to Russo and Sullivan for the first time. The department's internal affairs division began asking questions Russo couldn't dodge. Isaiah didn't celebrate. He didn't smile. He just stood by his window, watching the rain hit the glass, feeling both closer and farther from peace. Max's photo still sat on the table, the edges worn. He spoke quietly to it, the way soldiers speak to the dead. "I told you I'd make it right." But even he knew this was far from over. Russo wasn't finished, and neither was he. Each action now had a counteraction. Every move toward justice came with a price. The war had officially begun. And this time, it wasn't being fought overseas, it was being fought in the streets of Chicago, one lie at a time, one truth at a cost. The city awoke to chaos. Before dawn, a video leaked online showing officers Vincent Russo and Patrick Sullivan entering a private residence without a warrant. The footage, grainy but clear, captured their voices, their threats, and a line that froze viewers across Chicago. No cameras on, no witnesses, no problem. Within hours, it hit every major network. By noon, the Chicago Tribune published a full exposé with the headline, "Corrupt Cops for Hire, Bribery, Brutality, and Betrayal." The evidence was impossible to ignore. Audio clips of cash exchanges with gang members, surveillance stills of bribes under neon lights, and documents tying both officers to extortion schemes that stretched back 5 years. Isaiah had orchestrated the release meticulously. He didn't gloat. He didn't post. He simply watched as the storm he'd built began to devour the men who had taken everything from him, outside the federal courthouse. Crowds gathered with signs reading, "Justice for Englewood and no more badges above the law." Naomi Carter, Isaiah's sister, stood on the courthouse steps giving a statement to reporters. "This isn't just about one man or one dog. It's about accountability. It's about the system that protects the violent and punishes the innocent." Cameras flashed, her voice firm but shaking. She didn't know Isaiah was across the street, hidden under a hoodie, watching from the shadows. He admired her courage, but felt the sting of guilt, because he knew the evidence she was using had been gathered through methods she'd never condone. Russo, enraged and cornered, tried to strike back. He met Malik Thompson, the former boxer and activist who had once been beaten half to death by his own unit, at a diner on the West Side. "You want to stay out of trouble. You'll help me bury Jackson," Russo said, sliding an envelope across the table. Malik looked at it for a moment, then pushed it back. "You buried enough people already." He left without another word. What Russo didn't know was that Isaiah had planted a mic under the table hours earlier. Every word was recorded, every threat immortalized. That night, Russo and Sullivan drove to Naomi's house. They parked 2 blocks away, lights off, rain hammering down on the windshield. "We grab her. We make him come to us," Russo muttered. Sullivan hesitated, gripping the wheel. "She's his sister, Vince. That's not part of this." Russo shot him a look cold enough to freeze blood. "She's leverage. That's all she is." Sullivan's stomach turned, but he followed orders. They broke in through the back door just as Naomi finished a call with a Tribune reporter. She heard footsteps, grabbed her phone, and whispered, "Zay, they're here." Isaiah was already en route. He'd been tracking Russo's car through a hacked GPS relay. When the call came, his blood went cold. He floored the accelerator, weaving through traffic, his heart pounding with military precision. He didn't panic. He calculated. Lakeshore Drive opened ahead of him, wet and gleaming under the city lights. Naomi's terrified breathing crackled through the phone, followed by the sound of glass breaking. "Stay low," he ordered, voice like steel. "Don't move until I tell you." Russo dragged Naomi toward the front door, yelling for Isaiah to show himself. Sullivan, caught between orders and conscience, hesitated at the threshold. "Vince, enough!" he shouted. Russo ignored him. Gun raised. That's when Isaiah's car appeared at the end of the street, engine roaring like a beast unchained. He hit the brakes hard, stepping out with deliberate calm, rain soaking his jacket. "Let her go," he said. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of command. Russo grinned. "You think you're still in the army? Hero? This is my city." He fired once, the bullet shattering a window beside Isaiah's head. The return shot never came. Isaiah didn't need one. He reached for the remote in his pocket and triggered the security lights he'd installed around Naomi's home days earlier. Every bulb exploded to life, flooding the scene with blinding white. Hidden cameras blinked red, streaming live to the Tribune's feed. Russo froze, realization dawning too late. "Smile for Chicago," Isaiah said quietly. Sullivan dropped his weapon. Russo cursed, firing again, missing wildly as Isaiah ducked behind his car. The chase began. 2 police cruisers, 1 black SUV, and a single man who refused to die quietly. They tore down Lakeshore Drive, engines screaming, tires slicing through sheets of rain. Russo's voice bellowed through the radio. "All units, officer under attack!" A lie designed to bring backup. But Isaiah's plan had accounted for that. He switched lanes abruptly, leading them toward a construction zone near the pier where barriers narrowed the path to 1 lane. Russo followed, blinded by fury. Isaiah's SUV slid sideways, blocking the road. Russo tried to ram him but hit a concrete divider instead. The impact folded metal like paper. Sullivan's car skidded to a stop behind him, smoke rising. Isaiah approached slowly, his gun drawn but aimed low. "You had a choice," he said, looking at Sullivan. "You could have walked away." Sullivan, shaking, raised his hands. I'm done. Man." Russo coughed, clutching his ribs, glaring up. "You think this makes you righteous? You're no better than me." Isaiah leaned closer, rain dripping from his hood. "You killed an innocent soul because of your hate. Now you live with what comes next." He handed Sullivan a small flash drive, the same one containing the footage of every crime they'd committed. "Turn it in, tell the truth, or you'll wish I'd finished this my way." Then he walked away, fading into the storm. By morning, the city was in uproar. The Tribune ran another headline: "Justice or Vigilantism? Anonymous hero exposes Chicago's darkest cops." Protests surged through the loop, crowds chanting Max's name, holding signs with Isaiah's image, though few knew who he really was. Naomi, now under federal protection, delivered a televised statement that turned the nation's attention toward Chicago. "For years, we were told justice takes time, but justice delayed is justice denied. My brother's pain began with a bullet meant for fear, not safety. It ends with truth." Russo and Sullivan were suspended within hours. Internal Affairs raided their lockers, seizing cash, burner phones, and evidence of years of corruption. Captain Brooks, who had quietly gathered his own file against them, testified that he had warned the department months earlier. The mayor called for an emergency review of all officer conduct files citywide. But for Isaiah, it wasn't triumph. It was exhaustion. He sat in his apartment, bruised and silent, watching news clips of crowds chanting for reform. Naomi's voice on TV trembled with pride and fear. Malik texted him one word: respect. Isaiah looked at Max's photo one last time and whispered, "We did it. Buddy, you can rest now." Yet deep down, he knew it wasn't over. Russo's eyes in that alley had promised something, the look of a man who'd rather die than lose. Isaiah had exposed the truth, but truth has consequences, and men like Russo didn't fade quietly. He turned off the television, checked the safety on his pistol, and stared out at the flickering lights of Chicago. The city was awake, angry, alive, for the first time in a long while. Isaiah didn't feel alone, but he also knew peace was still a long way off. and the final reckoning was coming soon. 3 weeks later. Chicago stood still. The city that had once ignored the cries of Englewood now watched every minute of the most publicized police corruption trial in a decade. The federal courthouse was surrounded by barricades, reporters, and protesters carrying signs with words like "Justice for Max" and "Stop the Badge Abuse." Inside, the marble floors echoed with tension as Vincent Russo and Patrick Sullivan were escorted in, their wrists bound, their eyes defiant. They looked smaller now, stripped of the authority they'd once abused. Yet Russo still carried that same smirk, the arrogance of a man convinced the system he had served would protect him one last time. Isaiah Jackson sat quietly behind the prosecution table, wearing a dark suit, calm and still as stone. The cameras weren't on him, but every eye in that room felt his presence. When the judge called the session to order, the air seemed to hold its breath. The prosecution began by laying out the evidence Isaiah and Naomi had helped compile, videos of unauthorized raids, bribery exchanges, body cam footage that had been accidentally erased but later recovered from hidden drives. Each clip was like a nail in the coffin. The jury watched Russo shouting at a young man, "You people should be grateful we even protect this place." Another showed Sullivan striking a handcuffed suspect while laughing. Then came the footage from Isaiah's cameras, Russo and Sullivan breaking into his home, threatening Naomi, and admitting they'd make the soldier disappear. The courtroom fell silent. Russo shifted uncomfortably, whispering to his attorney. But there was nowhere to hide now. When it was Isaiah's turn to testify, the world seemed to slow. He walked to the stand with the composure of a man who had faced gunfire and walked through it. The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman named Carla Mendoza, asked softly, "Mr. Jackson, can you tell the court why you chose to gather this evidence yourself?" Isaiah's gaze never wavered. "Because no one else would," he said. "Because the system meant to protect us protects them. I knew if I didn't act, they'd hurt someone else. They already took my dog. They took my peace. I wasn't about to let them take another life." His words landed heavy, each syllable soaked in truth. A woman in the gallery sobbed quietly. The judge called for silence, but the emotion in the room was unstoppable. Then came Russo's turn to take the stand. He limped slightly, the ribs Isaiah had broken still healing. His lawyer urged him to stay calm, but Russo couldn't help himself. "I did what I had to do," he snapped. "You all sit here pretending you know what it's like out there. I protected this city from filth like him." He pointed directly at Isaiah, eyes wild, gasps rippled through the courtroom. The judge banged her gavel, ordering him to stop, but Russo kept going. "You call me corrupt? Look around. You need men like me to keep this place from burning." His voice cracked with fury, his face red, veins bulging, when he finally fell silent. It wasn't because the judge silenced him. It was because he realized the jury was staring at him not with sympathy, but disgust. Sullivan watched from the defense table, pale and shaking. He couldn't even look at Isaiah. Days earlier, he had tried to flee, driving toward O'Hare Airport with a bag of cash and fake documents. The FBI intercepted him on the tarmac. Now he sat, defeated, his eyes hollow, waiting for the sentence he knew was coming. Naomi Carter stood to deliver her closing argument. Though not the official prosecutor, she had been granted special permission to speak as co-counsel, representing victims' families and the broader community. Her voice was steady but filled with conviction. "This case isn't just about two officers," she began. "It's about the idea that some lives matter less than others. It's about a man who served his country, who came home broken but still believed in justice, until justice failed him. It's about a dog who died for nothing more than loyalty. And it's about a city that must finally decide who it protects. Her final words rang through the chamber like a verdict before the verdict. If the badge means power, then it must also mean accountability. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Outside, the streets were packed, crowds chanting, praying, waiting. When the foreman finally stood to read the decision, you could hear the hum of fluorescent lights over the silence. We find both defendants guilty on all counts: excessive force, bribery, extortion, and attempted murder. The words landed like thunder. Russo's jaw tightened. Sullivan's head dropped into his hands, in the back. Someone shouted, "Justice for Max!" The judge quickly restored order, but even she couldn't hide the faint tremor in her voice when she sentenced them. 35 years without parole. Russo exploded, standing and shouting across the room, "This is a setup! You think you're safe! Jackson, you're nothing without that mutt!" He lunged forward, but marshals grabbed him before he could take a step. Isaiah didn't flinch. He simply met Russo's eyes and said, "Max did what you never could. He protected someone without hate." The officers dragged Russo out, cursing until the sound faded down the hallway. Sullivan followed quietly, head bowed, whispering a prayer no one could hear. When court adjourned, reporters swarmed Naomi. She smiled weakly, thanking supporters but refusing interviews. Isaiah slipped out through a side exit, avoiding cameras, stepping into the late afternoon light. Chicago's skyline stretched before him, gray, beautiful, indifferent. For the first time in years, he felt something close to calm, not peace, but something quieter, like the moment after a storm when the air is still heavy, yet clean. That evening, he returned home to find a small crowd gathered outside his building. Neighbors, activists, strangers holding candles. They didn't cheer. They didn't chant. They just stood in silence, honoring Max, honoring what had been lost and what had been reclaimed. A little girl stepped forward, holding a hand-drawn sign that read, "Heroes don't always wear badges." Isaiah bent down, took the drawing gently, and whispered, "Thank you." He didn't stay long. He never liked attention, but as he walked inside, he realized this fight had grown beyond him. Naomi visited later that night. She found him sitting by the window again, staring at the rain. "It's over," she said softly. He shook his head. "No, it's never over, but it's a start." She sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "You did good, Zay. You really did." He smiled faintly. "We did good." For a long while, neither spoke. Outside, sirens wailed faintly in the distance, different sirens now, belonging to a city trying to rebuild. Isaiah closed his eyes, hearing Max's bark in his memory, not as a cry, but as an echo of loyalty that would never fade. Justice had come, but it came at a price only he understood. And as the rain fell harder against the glass, Isaiah Jackson, the soldier-turned-survivor, knew that in this imperfect world, sometimes the only way to heal was to fight, one last time, for what was right. 6 months later, Chicago had changed, or at least, it tried to. The protests had faded into reform meetings, police task forces, and news panels debating what accountability really meant. The names Vincent Russo and Patrick Sullivan had become symbols of everything broken in the system. Russo's trial transcripts were now case studies for ethics training across the country, but inside prison walls, justice took a different form. Russo lasted only half a year before the weight of his own hate devoured him, surrounded by the very men he had once terrorized. He became the hunted. He spent his final nights pacing his cell, sleepless, haunted by the echo of a gunshot and the face of a dog he never cared to know. When the guards found him one morning, his body hung lifeless from a bedsheet, and the note on the wall read, "I protected this city." The city barely blinked. The world moved on, but in the quiet corners of Englewood, some whispered that the ghost of guilt had finally collected its due. Patrick Sullivan, however, survived. He was transferred to a low-security facility after agreeing to testify against other corrupt officers. But survival was its own punishment. His family moved away. His wife filed for divorce, and no one in the department spoke his name. He lived in a one-room halfway house after release, working nights mopping floors at a bus terminal. People recognized him sometimes, not with anger, but with pity, the kind of pity that cuts deeper than hate, and every now and then. When he saw a man walking a dog down the street, he'd freeze, haunted by what his bullet had started. For Isaiah Jackson, life moved in slower rhythms now. The adrenaline was gone, replaced by a hollow calm that felt almost foreign. The media still searched for him, trying to unmask the anonymous hero of the Chicago justice scandal. But he kept his distance. He turned down interviews, declined book deals, and refused every invitation that tried to turn pain into spectacle. He wasn't interested in fame. He'd already learned what power did to men who sought it. Instead, he poured his energy into the Chicago Justice League, working quietly behind the scenes with Naomi and Malik. Together, they established the Max Foundation, a community fund supporting victims of police violence and therapy programs for veterans with PTSD. Every donation came with a message of gratitude, every story a reminder that pain could be transformed into purpose. One chilly November morning, Isaiah visited Graceland Cemetery. The grass was damp, the sky low and gray. He carried no flowers, just a framed photo of Max, the same one he'd kept by his window for months. The small headstone read, "Max, loyal beyond words." Isaiah knelt, his hands rough and trembling. "We made it, buddy," he whispered. "They paid for what they did." His voice caught, a single tear slipping down his cheek. "But I'd trade every bit of justice just to hear you bark again." He placed the photo against the stone, pressing his palm over it like a final salute. The wind moved gently through the trees, and for a moment, he imagined Max running again, free and unafraid, somewhere beyond the pain that men create. Naomi arrived quietly, standing a few steps behind. "You know," she said softly, "the city's naming a new animal shelter after him, the Max Jackson Rescue Center. They said it's for dogs who save people. I thought you'd want to know." Isaiah smiled faintly, still staring at the grave. "He saved me," he said. "More than anyone ever could." Naomi nodded, slipping her arm through his. "Then let that be enough." They stood in silence for a while, listening to the wind. Isaiah's thoughts drifted to the war, the nights in Englewood, the trial, the faces he couldn't forget. He realized he wasn't angry anymore, just tired, but in a way that felt clean. "I don't know what comes next," he said finally. Naomi smiled. "Then start with peace." That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Isaiah returned home and sat by the window once more. The collar still hung on the wall, the engraved tag catching a glint of orange light. He leaned back in his chair, eyes closed, letting the city's hum fade into the background. For the first time since that night, he felt something close to acceptance. The war inside him had quieted. The soldier in him would never vanish. But the man, what was left of him, was learning to live again. Somewhere outside, a siren wailed in the distance, fading into the wind. Isaiah opened his eyes, whispered a simple prayer for those still fighting battles they didn't ask for, and exhaled slowly. The city kept moving, flawed but alive. Justice hadn't fixed everything, but it had left a mark, and sometimes that was enough. As darkness settled over Chicago, Isaiah Jackson stood, touched Max's collar once more, and said the words he hadn't been able to speak since that night. "Thank you, my friend." Then he turned off the light, stepping into a quiet that finally felt like peace. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your support keeps these voices alive.